Right now, more than 250,000 people across southern Europe do not have a home to sleep in tonight. Not because of a war, not because of an earthquake, because of fire. Fire that has moved faster than entire emergency systems built to stop it. And the detail that should worry you most isn't the size of these fires. It's what officials in Madrid have said out loud on camera this week, that what's burning west of the Spanish capital is currently beyond the capacity of firefighters to contain. Stay with this, because by the end of it, you'll understand exactly why 3 of Western Europe's biggest countries are fighting fire with military hardware at the same time, and why officials are warning this is nowhere near finished. Spain, a national emergency around the capital. Let's start in Spain, because what's happening just outside Madrid should not, by any normal standard, be happening to a European capital city in the year 2026. This is not a regional wildfire being handled by local fire crews. Spain's national government activated an emergency declaration after 2 enormous blazes broke out west of Madrid, one of them burning near the town of San Martín de Valdeiglesias, sitting right on the boundary between the Madrid region and the province of Ávila. These are technically 2 separate fires, but along a stretch of roughly 14 to 15 kilometers, they've grown so close together that Spain's military emergency unit, the country's elite disaster response force, normally reserved for genuinely catastrophic events, took direct command of the entire firefighting operation, rather than leaving it to civilian fire services. The unit's commanding officer described the ongoing effort to keep the 2 fronts from merging into a single, unmanageable megafire as one of the operation's central tactical priorities. The numbers being thrown at the single fire zone are staggering. Spain deployed well over 2,700 personnel, more than 400 ground vehicles and 21 aircraft, and crews from Greece, Italy, and Portugal flew in because Spanish resources alone weren't enough to hold the line. And then came the sentence that stopped a lot of people cold. Carlos Novillo, the Madrid regional government's emergency management chief, told reporters the fire near the capital was at its peak and beyond. What firefighters could currently contain. That is about as blunt as an official statement gets. This is a government representative in charge of protecting the capital of one of Europe's largest economies, admitting on the record that his own firefighting resources cannot yet stop what is burning. The scale of ground lost kept shifting upward day by day. In the Madrid region alone, roughly 10,000 hectares had burned by the weekend, with officials in the community of Madrid later reporting that overnight flare-ups had pushed the total scorched area past 130 square miles. In neighboring Ávila province, estimates put the burned area between 13 and 15,000 additional hectares. Spain's Interior Ministry has tracked the human toll in real time as the crisis evolved. Figures moved from roughly 50,000 people affected in the wider Madrid region in the early days to more than 100,000 evacuated nationally within Spain by the following day, before settling around 63,000 people forced from their homes. Across the central regions of Madrid, Toledo, and Ávila, as the fires stabilized somewhat later in the week. Of those, around 24,000 had already been permitted to return by the time containment improved. At least 1 person has died in Spain's fires. More than 30 separate wildfires have burned simultaneously across the country during this stretch, stretching resources that were already fully committed to the capital region. Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez traveled to the emergency command post near the fire zone and told reporters the government's priority right now is simple: save lives and protect the towns still standing in the fire's path. He also warned that difficult hours lie ahead, because even as peak temperatures eased slightly, the winds remained unpredictable enough to reignite fronts that firefighters believed they had under control. Interior Minister Fernando Grande Marlaska echoed that warning bluntly on Spanish state broadcaster RTVE, telling the public that the coming night was not going to be easy, and that weather conditions had not helped at all. One detail that hasn't gotten nearly enough attention. Among the sites evacuated as a precaution was the Madrid Deep Space Communications Complex, one of only 3 facilities on Earth that NASA relies on to track and communicate with spacecraft across the solar system. When a wildfire forces the evacuation of infrastructure used to talk to interplanetary probes, that tells you something about how far this crisis has spread beyond what anyone expected a normal Spanish summer fire season to look like. By the middle of the week, smoke that had blanketed Madrid's metropolitan area began drifting away from the city, which briefly eased air quality concerns for residents there. But that localized relief didn't change the bigger picture. A World Meteorological Organization spokesperson noted that widespread smoke visible from satellites over both Spain and France had degraded air quality and raised health risks for millions of people well beyond the immediate fire perimeters. France, an evacuation on a wartime scale. If Spain's numbers are alarming, What's happening in southwestern France is on another level entirely. In the Gironde department, near France's Atlantic coast west of Bordeaux, wildfires have forced what officials are describing as the country's largest peacetime evacuation since the Second World War. Evacuation orders in Gironde alone have covered more than 167,000 residents, with roughly 31,000 Wildfires more ordered out of the neighboring Landes department in the first wave of the crisis, and those figures kept climbing as the fires spread. By later in the week, regional counts put the Gironde evacuation total above 220,000, with another 36,000 people displaced from Landes and thousands more moved out of additional threatened communities. Combined with Spain's displaced population, the two countries together have pushed the total number of people forced from their homes past 250,000, a genuinely historic figure for a European wildfire season, and one that keeps rising as containment lines shift. The worst of the French fires has been tearing through the Landes forest, the largest man-made forest in Western Europe. A vast plantation of maritime pine, originally planted in the 19th century to stabilize the region's sandy coastal dunes. Maritime pine is about as fire-friendly a tree as exists in Europe. Resin-rich, densely packed, and prone to carrying flame rapidly from canopy to canopy. And when a fire gets loose in that landscape during a drought, it has almost everything it needs to keep spreading. The commune of Le Porge, west of Bordeaux and home to roughly 3,500 residents, has been particularly hard hit, with local officials describing large parts of it as devastated. The resort area of Les Cap Ferret on the Atlantic coast was among the communities ordered to evacuate. Around 44,000 people fled the upscale Cap Ferret Peninsula alone after the only access road came under threat from the flames, with boats pulling residents off the peninsula by sea while others drove out ahead of the fire. More than 50 houses there have reportedly been destroyed. Emergency alerts went out directly to residents' phones across multiple communities near the fire front, directing people towards shelters in Bordeaux, which quickly filled with evacuees sleeping on rows of cots inside converted exhibition halls. A separate fire complex near Biscarrosse and Parentis-en-Born burned through more than 2,500 hectares on its own, triggering thousands of additional evacuation orders. Bordeaux itself, a metropolitan area of roughly 1 million people, was not directly threatened, according to its mayor, Thomas Cazenave. But the towns and suburbs surrounding it were evacuated in large numbers, even as the city center stayed open. Further out, some residents in areas without formal evacuation orders chose to leave anyway, describing the smell of smoke and ash hanging over their neighborhoods. France appealed for outside help, and the scale of the international response says a lot about how serious officials consider this. Crews and equipment arrived from multiple European countries, including Czech Black Hawk helicopters brought in specifically to help contain the fires in the southwest, alongside a major deployment of French military aircraft and cargo planes dropping fire retardant near Bordeaux. French President Emmanuel Macron addressed the crisis directly, calling the fires a serious ordeal for the affected region. At least one death has been confirmed in the French fires so far, and authorities have warned that continuing drought, low humidity, and unpredictable winds mean the fire fronts could surge again with very little warning. There's also a detail buried in the coverage that deserves more attention than it's gotten. Some of the areas evacuated on the western edge of Bordeaux sit close to facilities tied to France's defense and aerospace industry, including sites connected to the country's submarine-launched missile program. Those sites were evacuated as a precaution, and the companies involved say all necessary safety measures were taken, but it's a striking illustration of just how close this fire front has come to some of the most sensitive infrastructure in the country. And then there's Bordeaux wine country. One of the most famous wine-producing regions on Earth sits inside this fire zone. Wine industry experts have fielded a wave of anxious inquiries about a phenomenon called smoke taint, a process where grapes absorb compounds from wildfire smoke that can permanently alter and effectively ruin the wine made from them afterward. For now, at least, the news is cautiously reassuring. One wine specialist told reporters that the grapes around Bordeaux weren't yet ripe enough at this stage of the season to absorb smoke aromas, since they remain small and hard rather than sugar-rich. But a chemist who studies smoke taint cautioned that as the grapes ripen in the coming weeks, their sugars will start binding more readily with phenolic compounds carried in wildfire smoke, and that whether real damage occurs will depend heavily on wind direction relative to the vineyards over the following days. Bordeaux's vineyards represent generations of cultivation on land that cannot simply be relocated or replanted overnight, so the coming weeks matter enormously for growers who won't know the fate of the 2026 vintage until the smoke situation resolves one way or the other. Even Britain's Prince William weighed in on the unfolding crisis, calling the wildfires hitting Spain, France, and the United Kingdom a stark reminder of the challenges posed by an increasingly extreme climate. a comment that underlined just how far the reach of this particular fire season has extended across Western Europe's public consciousness, well beyond the three main countries directly ablaze. Italy. A different kind of crisis, same underlying cause. Italy's wildfire emergency looks a little different from Spain's and France's, but it is being driven by exactly the same conditions, and it is unfolding on multiple fronts simultaneously. In the south, Sicily and Sardinia have both faced waves of serious fire activity for weeks, compounded by a brutal heat wave that has pushed temperatures in parts of Sicily above 45 degrees Celsius. On Sicily's northern east coast, a wildfire broke out near Agliento, forcing the evacuation of beachgoers, and fires have swept through wooded and scrub terrain across multiple provinces. Sicily alone accounted for more than 24,000 hectares, burned by late July, including a single brutal week in which nearly 17,000 hectares went up in smoke. Elsewhere on the island, roughly 100 residents and more than 20 patients from a clinic in the inland town of Santo Stefano Quisquina had to be evacuated as local temperatures pushed past 40 degrees Celsius. A firefighter in Sicily died of a suspected heart attack while battling flames at the center of the island. And in the neighboring region of Calabria, authorities recorded more than 160 separate fire outbreaks in a single 24-hour period. On Italy's Adriatic coast in Apulia, the Italian Coast Guard rescued more than 400 tourists and swimmers trapped by a fire near Peschici that left the beach with no escape route except by sea, private boats and rescue vessels pulling people directly out of the water while smoke rolled across the coastline behind them. Italy's environmental monitoring body, ISPRA, has pointed to an uncomfortable statistic underlying all of this. Only around 1% of Italian wildfires are estimated to start from purely natural causes such as lightning. The remaining 99% are human-caused, split between simple negligence, discarded cigarettes, unsupervised agricultural burning, poorly maintained power infrastructure, and deliberate arson, which Italian authorities have flagged as a persistent driver of the country's worst fire seasons for years. What has changed is not how fires start, but how they behave once they do. The same officials note that prolonged drought, record heat, and strong regional winds like the Libeccio and Sirocco are now routinely turning what would once have been minor, containable ignitions into landscape-scale infernos, because the vegetation across so much of the country is primed to burn. Meanwhile, in the north, a very different but equally serious crisis has been unfolding along the Po River, Italy's longest river and the water source that farms and towns across the entire Po Valley depend on. Flow along the river has fallen to roughly 30% of its normal summer level. Measurements at Cremona in early July showed the river running at about 278 cubic meters per second, compared with a 30-year average closer to 930. Alpine lakes that feed the river, including Lake Maggiore, have dropped to unusually low levels for this point in the summer, with Maggiore sitting at under half of capacity and continuing to fall. The Veneto region declared its own state of emergency over the shortage. And in Piedmont, roughly 100 municipalities introduced water rationing measures, including fines for anyone caught using drinking water to wash cars or water gardens, a level of restriction that one of the wealthiest, most industrialized regions in Europe has rarely had to impose. Italy's fire season overall is already tracking above its long-term average for burned area this year, continuing a trend that made 2025 the worst wildfire year recorded across the European Union since systematic tracking. Began in the mid-2000s, with more than 1 million hectares burned continent-wide that year alone. By early July 2026, the European Forest Fire Information System had already logged more than 11,500 hectares burned across Italy for the year, with over 5,000 of those hectares burning in June and July alone as the current heat wave took hold. Why this is happening, and why it's different from previous fire seasons. Here's the part that a lot of coverage skips past. This isn't 3 unrelated national emergencies that happen to be occurring at the same time. All 3 are downstream of the same underlying condition. A prolonged, severe heat wave sitting over southern and western Europe, combined with drought conditions that have left vegetation across the region dry enough to ignite from almost nothing. What makes this year's fires behave differently from the fires Europe dealt with a decade or 2 ago isn't simply that temperatures are higher, although they are. It's that the specific combination of conditions that produces a genuinely dangerous fire, extreme heat, extended drought, and erratic high winds, is now showing up together, in the same place far more often than it used to. Vegetation that is moderately dry burns slower and can often be contained. Vegetation that has gone through months of drought behaves more like stored fuel than living plant matter, and a fire moving through it can outrun the crews trying to build containment lines around it. The wind factor is what has made containment so difficult, even with the sheer scale of resources deployed. Firefighting crews can cut fire breaks and drop water or retardant from aircraft, and under normal conditions those tactics work. But when wind direction shifts suddenly, as it has repeatedly in both the Madrid and Gironde fire zones. A containment line that was protecting one flank of a fire can end up behind the new fire front within minutes. Crews then have to reposition entirely, and in the time that takes, more ground burns. Spanish officials specifically flagged unpredictable wind as one of the reasons the fire near Madrid kept re-escalating even after firefighters believed they'd made progress. And the same dynamic has played out repeatedly in the Gironde region, where officials have described conditions as simply not cooperating. There's also a longer-term pattern behind all of this that European climate researchers have been tracking for years. Wildfire seasons across the continent have been getting both longer and more intense, and the total area burned annually across Europe has been climbing sharply. Italian environmental researchers at ISPRA have noted that the Mediterranean is warming at roughly twice the global average rate, a factor they connect directly to the lengthening of the fire season in southern and central Europe. Reporting this week has also pointed to a roughly 57% increase in burned area across Europe over the past 4 years, a trend line that, if it continues, will keep testing the limits of what mutual aid between European countries can realistically cover. Right now, 8 or more countries are already lending personnel and equipment to help Spain and France fight fires on foreign soil, on top of running their own domestic fire seasons. That system is being stretched hard by this single fire season. It is not built to absorb one that's more than half again as large as it used to be. The human cost behind the numbers. It's easy to let figures like 267,000 evacuated or 45,000 hectares burned wash over you as abstractions. But behind every one of those numbers is a household that had to decide, often with very little warning, what to grab on the way out the door and what to leave behind. In Le Porge, families who had lived for generations in homes surrounded by pine forest returned, where they've been allowed to return at all, to find neighborhoods unrecognizable. On the Cap Ferret Peninsula, some of the wealthiest residents in France found that money and property value meant nothing against a fire front with only one road out. They left the same way as everyone else, in cars and on boats, watching smoke rise over homes they couldn't be sure would still be standing by. Morning. In Spain, evacuees have spent nights on cots in shelters in towns like Las Rozas de Madrid, uncertain whether the fire crews would hold the line closer to their own neighborhoods. In Sicily, patients from a medical clinic had to be moved out, along with the rest of the town's residents. A reminder that evacuation orders don't only displace the healthy and mobile, they force hospitals, care facilities, and vulnerable populations into logistically difficult moves under time pressure. Firefighters themselves have paid a price too. The death of a Sicilian firefighter from a suspected heart attack while battling flames in extreme heat is a reminder that the physical toll of this kind of firefighting, hours of exertion in full protective gear in temperatures well above 40 degrees Celsius, breathing smoke-laden air, is its own serious occupational hazard, separate entirely from the risk of being caught by the fire itself. Why wildfire season keeps arriving earlier and hitting harder? Southern Europe has always had a wildfire season. Spain, France, and Italy have decades of institutional experience fighting summer fires, and none of the 3 countries is short on trained personnel, aircraft, or coordination protocols. What has shifted is the baseline conditions those systems now have to operate against. Drought that builds up over consecutive years leaves soil and vegetation with less residual moisture heading into each new summer, meaning it takes less heat and less time for plant material to become genuinely flammable. Combine that with heat waves that push temperatures well above seasonal norms for extended stretches, and the fuel across huge areas of forest, scrubland, and even managed farmland is primed to ignite from something as small as a discarded cigarette, a spark from machinery, or, as Italian officials have repeatedly noted, deliberate arson. Once ignited, that same dried-out vegetation burns faster and hotter than it would in a normal year. And erratic. Wind patterns that used to be occasional now show up with much greater regularity during the peak of fire season, making containment lines far less reliable than firefighting commanders can plan around. None of this is unique to 2026. Fire seasons in 2021, 2022, and 2023 all produced serious, sometimes deadly outbreaks in exactly these same regions. Sardinia's Monteferru fire in 2021 burned around 20,000 hectares and displaced hundreds of people, and Sicily recorded a European heat record of 48.8 degrees Celsius that same summer amid a wave of destructive fires. What 2026 represents is not a single unprecedented anomaly, but the continuation and intensification of a pattern that has been building for years, arriving now against a backdrop. 2025's record-breaking million-pound storm, plus hectares burned across the EU, that already represented the worst fire year on record for the entire bloc. What this means going forward. The uncomfortable truth in almost every official statement coming out of Madrid, Bordeaux, and Rome this week is the same. None of these fires can be considered fully controlled until the weather itself changes, and forecasters aren't expecting that change anytime soon. Authorities in multiple regions have warned that extreme wildfire danger could persist well into August. For the people directly affected, the risk doesn't end the moment a fire is finally contained. Drought conditions that built up over months won't fully recover before next summer's fire season begins. Forested land that took decades to grow, in some cases pine forest that takes 40 to 60 years to return to anything resembling its pre-fire state, can be gone within a single week. And this year's fires are burning in places that historically weren't considered high-risk zones in quite the same way. Mountainous terrain close enough to Madrid that smoke has drifted over the capital itself and a globally famous wine region on the doorstep of one of France's largest cities. If there's a single message running through official communications in all three countries right now, it's this: follow evacuation orders immediately without waiting to see how a fire develops. In several cases this week, fires, have moved faster than the evacuation orders meant to get ahead of them. The people who left as soon as they were told generally had time to gather what they needed. The people who waited to see how bad things would get were often the ones who needed to be rescued, whether by road convoy out of Cap Ferret or by boat off a besieged Adriatic beach in Apulia. More than 250,000 people are displaced tonight across Spain and France, with tens of thousands more affected in Italy. Firefighters from across Europe are working through the night in conditions where the smoke itself poses a health risk. Military aircraft are dropping retardant on forests that 2 weeks ago were summer resort destinations. And officials whose entire job is public reassurance have gone in front of cameras this week and said plainly that they cannot yet stop what is burning. This is where the situation stands right now. It is not close to over, and the coming days will likely determine just how much worse it still gets before conditions finally start to turn.